He sent her an invitation he thought would be the final insult. She arrived in a Rolls-Royce with 3 small hands tucked into hers, and the room went silent. She was Sarah Morales, once married to Mark Ellis for 7 years. He had branded her as a failure for not giving him children and had kicked her out of their house on a rainy Tuesday. Months later, a single public scene changed everything and turned social feeds into a courtroom of opinion. What came next did not humiliate her. It exposed him. It unraveled a secret he had tried to bury while she rebuilt a life from the ground up. They called her quiet and resigned. She was calm and steady, and now, finally, whole. Stay with the story to see how a carefully staged humiliation became the moment a life turned. How the truth slipped from a private file to the center of a banquet hall. And why the people who laughed first were the ones who had to look for answers later. You will not believe the last minute. It all began on an ordinary Thursday when a printed envelope arrived on her kitchen table and a neighbor asked a question that felt like a match to dry paper. The first memory that stayed clear was the sound of the front door slamming. Mark had stood in the doorway, his face taut with contempt, the rain flattening his hair, the city light bending off the wet pavement like a promise never to return. Inside, the apartment smelled of cold coffee and laundry soap. Sarah had one bag, a thin pile of books, and a passport. She had left with a look that was small but final. The rupture did not happen in a single blow. It was a series of small shoves. A sentence here, a dismissal there, until the last shove sent her into the street. The night she left, the neighbors came to the window. Rosa from across the hall whispered to Carla, the landlord, how unfair it looked. Their voices were a low hum under the thump of rain and the siren down the block. In the hallway, a neighbor named Paul offered his umbrella and then awkwardly handed her a call list of shelters and phone numbers. The world smelled of wet concrete and cheap perfume that night, and Sarah felt the weight of every gaze like a ledger that would be called later. Inside the small motel she rented for 2 weeks, the fluorescent light buzzed with an indifference that made everything seem provisional. Her hands memorized the ring she had taken off the day before and put into a shoebox. The ring was cold. The box smelt faintly of cedar and perfume. She slept on top of the covers because it felt less permanent, and in the morning she made coffee in a chipped mug that held warmth like a promise. That mug would travel with her for months, a small anchor against panic. Mia called every other night. She worked at a bookstore 2 blocks from the subway, and she would bring bagels and lend an ear. Daniel was the man who would later become important. He knocked once at the motel door with a bouquet of grocery store flowers and stories about his dog to make her laugh. He would be patient in a way she did not expect. The first public humiliation came months earlier than the final scene. Mark had liked to organize gatherings with their ex-friends, a way to show control disguised as hospitality. He invited her back to a dinner party once and then used an offhand comment to humiliate her about not having children. The room had been warm with roast and laughter. The smell of thyme and lemons still lingered when he said the words that would become the echo in her head for years. People shifted in their seats. Pastor Michael tried to change the subject. Olivia, who had been Mark's co-worker and now an influencer, laughed in a way that made Sarah feel small. Paul looked down at his plate and pretended to be busy. The dinner ended with an apology that was not hers to make. In the weeks after the final eviction, Sarah found herself walking along the river at dawn, the air cool and clean enough to make her lungs feel new. She counted each step like a bead on a rosary. She began to work at a small catering company owned by Rosa and run by Chef Antonio. The kitchen smelled of garlic, roasted peppers, and the metallic tang of the oven. Her hands learned rhythm as she chopped, stirred, plated. The work was steady. The money was small but honest. When she closed the metal door behind her at the end of a long shift, the stainless steel left a cold handprint in her palm that she would mentally trace like a map home. One night at the restaurant, a fight between Sarah and Mark flared again on the sidewalk. The dialogue came rapid and hungry, each one trying to claim the exact wording that would make the other flinch. They argued with old accusations and new detachment. The sequence was raw and full of trade that read like ripples in a glass trying to find shape. "Why are you here?" Mark asked, voice pitched with an attempt to sound casual. "You invited me," Sarah said, voice flat, the city noise filling the space between their sentences. "I thought it would be funny," Mark said, like unwinding a strip of tape. "Humiliation is not funny," Sarah returned, and the air smelled of rain and car exhaust. "Everyone will laugh with me," Mark insisted. "Are you laughing now?" Sarah asked, looking at the passers-by. A woman named Olivia glanced quickly away, her camera phone lifted as if to capture a moment to monetize. "This is embarrassing," Paul muttered to Rosa, who shook her head and offered Sarah a closed fist that said, "I am here." "He always does this," Carla said, more to herself than to anyone. The exchange kept going, each line a pebble tossed into a pond that would later ripple wider. After that night, Sarah started collecting evidence of the small cruelties, not for revenge, but to keep a ledger for herself. Emails, voicemails, screenshots of posts where Mark tagged her in jokes, receipts of flights he booked without her knowledge, medical records that would later matter. She cataloged everything with the calm of someone assembling a map. It was not obsessive at first, it was the simple act of naming what happened so it could be seen. In the back of her mind, she feared being only anecdote if she could not prove the shape of what had been done. The months after she left were a lesson in slow accumulation. She learned to answer the phone with a new voice. She met a lawyer named Jenna briefly in a coffee shop, a woman with a calm demeanor and a folder full of experience, who listened and then, without grand promise, said, "We will look into this." Jenna introduced her to Dr. Chen for a consultation about a contested document that would later be relevant. Dr. Chen had soft hands and a precise way of explaining procedures as if they were small machines that, once understood, could be repaired. Over time, the small things assembled into a path forward. Sarah's backstory was not a single wound, but a pattern formed through childhood and choices. She grew up in a small coastal town where her mother worked 2 jobs, and her father left before she could remember his face clearly. There were summers spent wading in cold seawater, and nights listening to the refrigerator hum as her mother read aloud from tattered novels. School was the place she learned to make silence into study, and concentration into chance. At university, she studied literature and sociology, and learned to read people as carefully as text. After graduation, she moved to the city for a job she loved at a nonprofit that coordinated weekend programs for children. She loved the work of helping others tell their own stories, and learned how to balance empathy with boundaries. Her marriage to Mark began as a compromise and a promise. He offered stability and a kind of charisma that made him popular among his colleagues at the tech firm where he worked. For a while, they fit together well enough. But small things began to tip. Mark wanted a certain image. He wanted children only when it fit his timeline. He made decisions that prioritized his status, and then found quickness to anger when the world did not bend to his will. Sarah had losses before the marriage ended, quiet losses that shaped her. The loss of trust, the loss of the life she imagined, the loss of a name used in kindness transformed into a coin to pay for his jokes. Each loss was a lesson in restraint, and later a reason to build rather than to break. She had been resilient out of necessity. When the marriage ended, there was no dramatic confrontation over custody because they had not had children. There was instead a slow erasure of shared life that made space for her to create new routines. Her years of working with families taught her that dignity was often recovered in small, repetitive acts. Those habits became the foundation of a plan that would not look like vengeance. It would look like work. It would look like care. It would look like success. The search for truth moved from the margin to the center at a small clinic where procedural explanations felt clinical and human at once. The technical report read like a machine note. In plain terms, a chain of custody protocol was established for documents Mark had claimed were altered. A notary inspection verified ink and dates, a file audit traced edits in a shared drive, and metadata analysis showed discrepancies in timestamps consistent with manipulation. The report described the methods used, the instruments, the time frame, and the legal weight of the findings. It was precise, dry, and carried the authority Sarah needed to challenge a narrative she had been trying to unsettle. At the clinic, the sterile smell of antiseptic mixed with the perfume of the receptionist. The beep of a monitor, the scratch of a pen, the click of a keyboard. Dr. Chen explained the tests in a voice that was concise and patient. The procedural description that would later matter read like this. They extracted printouts and digital logs, sealed them in evidence bags, logged chain of custody numbers, and then delivered the reports to Jenna for review. The summary was short but heavy. It altered the arc of several conversations that would follow. After the evidence surfaced and Jenna verified the authenticity, Sarah began to rebuild publicly. She took the small catering business where she had been a line cook and proposed a weekly community supper. Rosa supported her, and Antonio believed in her bolder menus. Daniel invested small capital he had been saving, less as romantic gesture and more as faith in a steady person. The business became a place where the smell of roasting tomatoes meant possibility. Tablecloths were ironed so the edges caught the light, and a chalkboard menu announced the nightly specials in looping hand. Customers came because of the food and stayed for the hope it tasted like. Her days acquired an architecture. Morning inventory checks with Rosa, conversation with a supplier named Miguel about fresh basil and the way the leaves smelled wet in the box. Midday testing of a new sauce that smelled of wine and caramelized onions, afternoon calls with Jenna, evening service with Antonio, and the clatter of plates. The restaurant building smelled like lemon oil and wood smoke. She slept at night more easily because exhaustion from meaningful work was a different kind of tiredness than worry. Olivia posted once about the dinner and called it charming. It was not viral, but it was honest. In the kitchen, there were people who mattered. Chef Antonio, whose voice was loud enough to be comforting, taught her to sear without fear. Rosa organized staff schedules and taught her blunt kindness. Miguel, the supplier, argued about the price of basil and then gifted extra on slow nights. Pastor Michael showed up occasionally with casseroles for volunteers. Carla, the landlord, checked the safety certificates and gave her quiet thumbs up. Each person in that list played a role in scaffolding the new life she built. Recovery was not linear. There were nights when she read old messages and felt the old sting. There were also mornings when a child would come into the restaurant with a crayon drawing and leave it under the tip jar. Those drawings, messy and bright, would become a small framed collage that she hung behind the counter. It reminded her what she now offered. Not only food, but a safe place. Her success was measured in days kept, meals served, tips that grew, the first time a table of strangers clapped for a special dessert because the chef had outdone himself. Then something unexpected happened. At 6 weeks into the new venture, Daniel and Sarah had a conversation that shifted the axis of possibility. They sat at a small table in the back of the restaurant after service. The air smelled of lemon zest and coffee grounds. There were 4 exchanges that were light and then folded into deeper conversation. But what followed was an intimacy that felt safe. Daniel had a past of his own. He had been married early and learned humility through loss. He did not rush. He asked simple questions and listened. His presence became a stabilizing force rather than an anchor that wanted to bind. One evening, the invitation arrived. It was crisp, embossed, and called Mark and his fiancée to a charity gala that promised a night of performances and speeches. He sent the invitation to Sarah with a short message that read, "Please consider attending." The suggestion of attendance felt like a trap designed to produce a picture for his social media. She considered not going. Jenna suggested they use it as an opportunity to attend quietly and observe. Daniel asked if she wanted to be accompanied. Sarah thought about the motel room and a mug that had traveled with her. She thought about the ledger she had made of small cruelties and the evidence that Dr. Chen had collected. She chose to attend, but not in a way he expected. Before the gala, she spoke with friends.
Mia braided her hair into a style that made her feel like an armor made of softness. Rosa lent a dress that fit like a story she had not yet told. Daniel drove her to the venue, in the concert.
Rolls-Royce he had rented as a surprise, but also as a symbol. The car smelled of leather and a new car fragrance. The engine hummed like a purring animal. The velvet interior pressed softly against her shoulder. She held the hands of the 3 small children she had been fostering through a friend, a quiet decision she had made months earlier. The children who would later be the visual proof that her life had meaning beyond the gossip. At the entrance to the ballroom, the air changed. Warm lighting turned faces golden. The scent of perfume and polished silver filled the space. The sound of chatter formed a low ocean of expectation. Cameras snapped. An influencer named Olivia leaned forward, phone raised, the screen throwing a bright rectangle onto a face that tried to smile. Mark noticed first, his face tightening as he saw the car and then the children. The room held its breath. The climax was choreographed by happenstance and careful planning. Sarah walked slowly, not to show, but to be present. The sensory detail of the scene was intense. The chandeliers scattered light into small moons. The polished floor reflected the guests as if they were walking on water. The whisper smelled of perfume and cheap cologne. There was the metallic clink of cutlery. The hush felt like velvet dropping over the room. Cameras clicked like distant rain. The entry smelled of cologne, lemon, dust, and the warm, stale sweetness of layered cakes on the serving tables. A waiter brushed by carrying champagne that caught the light like liquid gold. The air carried a third element, the faint acrid scent of someone smoking behind the service doors. The public confrontation that followed was not raised voice, but a sequence of reveals. Jenna handed a printed copy of the report to the gala organizer, a man named Robert who had been a mutual friend and who read the first line with a growing line of unease across his forehead. The interaction that followed in front of an audience had exchanges that read like a courtroom in miniature. The dialogue was precise and extended. "Mark," Jenna said quietly, then louder so the people at the nearest table could hear, "there are inconsistencies in the documents you presented about Sarah." "What is this?" Mark asked, the word brittle and thirsty for control. "It is a verified audit," Jenna answered. "Metadata shows edits and timestamps that contradict your account." "Are you accusing me?" Mark said, his face flushing a sharp red under the chandelier lights. "I am presenting facts," Jenna said, calm, voice steady like a metronome. "The chain of custody was broken, and the records altered to support your claim that Sarah agreed to certain terms that she did not." "She must be making this up," Mark said, then looked around to find allies. "Look at these dates," Dr. Chen said, holding up a folder. "This is the time-stamped log from the shared drive." "But who cares?" Someone at a nearby table murmured. "People care," Pastor Michael said, rising slowly as if to lend weight to the moment. "We care about the truth." "Do you expect us all to take the word of 2 strangers?" Olivia snapped, her phone still lifted. "You can see the evidence," Jenna said, "or you can look the other way, but the truth will not be altered by selective memory." There were more lines, more exchanges, each one picked up by the phones in the room. The sequence included at least 8 direct turns where the crowd listened like a jury. Mark tried to interrupt, to ridicule, to flatten the moment into a spectacle. Instead, the reverse happened. People turned their phones to record. The social feeds started to light up with short videos. The wedding planner who had worked on Mark's earlier events, a woman named Layla, whispered something to Robert that made him put the folder down with a small sound like a breath released. The reaction of the public was immediate. Table conversations died down. Some guests looked at Mark with a new expression. Olivia lowered her phone and then raised it again, perhaps deciding whether to take a position that would gain her followers more than it would give anyone justice. Paul, who had once looked away, leaned forward in his chair and asked quiet questions that moved the conversation into a space of inquiry. The pastor suggested a moment of pause and thought.
Social media became verdict. Clips of Jenna presenting the audit circulated, and hashtags that had once been playful became serious. The sensation of the room shifted from festive to nervous to attentive. People pulled their friends aside and whispered. A few stood and left. In that charged silence, Sarah was offered a microphone by Daniel, who had faith that the truth needed to be said without drama. Her voice was steady but not loud. The sensory detail here lasted in the minds of those who watched. Her voice, soft, precise, steady, cut into the hush. The microphone hummed. The sound of her words traveled like a small bell through the chandeliers and across polished tables. "Some of you know pieces of my life," she began. "Some of you know a version that came easy to believe. I am not here to humiliate. I am here to be seen as I am." She told parts of her ledger that were relevant and small. She did not aim to destroy him publicly. She aimed to anchor reality in what was true. The room shifted. Cameras recorded, not a spectacle, but a correction. Mark stood, red-faced and sputtering, unable to find the performance he had rehearsed. The crowd, which had once been ready to laugh, now watched as a man confronted the consequences of his own edits. After the gala, the story went online fast. Influencers debated, news outlets contacted Jenna, and Dr. Chen provided formal statements that corroborated the findings. The public reaction was a mix of
outrage and sympathy. Olivia posted a long apology for having once laughed at Sarah at the dinner years ago. Paul wrote a short note on his social feed about how hard it was to change his mind, but how important truth was. Layla canceled the event planning contract she had set to sign with Mark. People reached out to Sarah with messages, some supportive, some skeptical, but the momentum had shifted. At roughly 1/3 into her public ordeal and private recovery, the channel cut for a moment for a small request. If this story touched you, leave a comment below starting with "I would have done." Tell us what you would have done in her place. Your words help others who feel isolated and give courage to those who think they are alone. Community matters more than applause. Share a small kindness or a memory of someone who stood up for you. We read everything, and we owe much to the people who show up for one another. The comment box filled with raw sympathies and practical advice. People named moments from their own lives, some with similar injustices, some with small victories. A woman named Jenny wrote about a similar experience with an ex-partner and how she reopened a bakery as a new life. A man named Omar shared how he had once ignored someone in pain and how that memory haunted him. The comments became a small public therapy, a chorus that reminded people the story was not an isolated spectacle, but part of a web of human experience. Legal action followed the public exposure. Jenna filed a complaint, and the matter entered a quieter sphere of formal inquiry. There were procedural descriptions that read like a legal manual: affidavits, sworn statements, notarized documents, metadata reports, and deposition transcripts. A formal audit docket was opened, and an investigator named Harper requested digital backups, server logs, and witness statements. The process was not immediate, but each step tightened the narrative into a record. The technical description of the audit was meticulous. For the legal team, chain of custody meant each document was cataloged, each timestamp verified, and each edit traced back to its origin. This precision took patience and money. It also required a patience Sarah had spent months building. Inside these procedural exchanges, there were moments of tension where the weight of possible outcomes pressed on her chest. At the hearing where the audit was first presented in a formal setting, the corridor smelled of old paper and printer ink. Sarah sat in a waiting room with people whose faces were half shadowed by anxiety. Her palms were damp. In the room where the presentation happened, the air seemed to shrink. The first paragraph of Mr. Harper's summary laid out the evidence and the way decisions had been manipulated. Those minutes of waiting and then hearing read like a compressed pressure. Her mind brought back the motel room and the cold surface of the shoebox. She thought of the children she had at that moment in her life, and the image of the Rolls-Royce entrance in the ballroom only days before. She had to choose between letting fear make her small again or letting the facts carry her forward. This was the moment where private memory and public record met. When the legal process moved forward, Mark attempted to counter with denials and an appeal to character. He hired counsel who argued that the documents were legitimate and that any discrepancies were clerical. But witnesses like Miguel and Antonio, who had seen the way he had spoken privately, came forward. There were also messages from a mutual friend, Robert, who admitted he had once been coaxed into believing Mark's version because it benefited his social standing. The community that had once been a chorus of laughter shifted into a reluctant assembly of truth-seekers. The surprise that followed months of quiet work was not a single event, but a shaped cascade. The community supper nights at the restaurant grew in attendance, with regulars bringing friends to taste a menu that had become shorthand for second chances. The 3 children Sarah had fostered began to call her aunt in private, a name they used with shy devotion. Daniel proposed a small partnership in the business, not as a takeover, but as a shared effort. He suggested they expand the seating, apply for a small grant, and file the necessary paperwork to become a certified community kitchen. Then another surprise came. A local publisher named Olivia Harper contacted her to propose a short piece about rebuilding after public shaming. Olivia had been an influencer who had made poor choices in the past. This proposal included a brief interview and an offer of a small fee that would help pay legal bills. It was unexpected and practical. The piece ran and drew attention to the restaurant and the work Sarah was doing with foster kids in the neighborhood. The public crescendo returned when Mark, in an attempt to salvage pride, arranged a ceremony that he called a rededication and expected to dominate the headlines. He sent invitations broadly and assumed attendees would perform the social ritual of siding with him. Instead, the invite list included names that had changed. People like Layla and Pastor Michael declined with gentle messages. Olivia published a note about learning to listen. Robert issued a short statement of regret for being complicit with his silence. The social fabric around Mark had shifted, and where he expected support, there was a thinning of allies. The big public scene that had been intended as his triumph became the arena for truth. This time, the sensory palette was thick and deliberate. The ceremony hall smelled of white roses and melted wax. The carpeting muffled footsteps into a soft hush. Silverware clicked with nervous rhythm. The lights focused and painted faces in gold and shadow. Photographers circled like curious birds. The buzz of held conversation folded into an expectant silence. It was a stage ready for performance, and this time the audience would not be a passive set of props. In the scene that would be replayed across feeds, Sarah entered not with the intention to humiliate, but to be present as evidence of a life. The Rolls-Royce doors opened, and she stepped out holding 3 small hands. The children laughed and tugged at the hem of her dress. Cameras rose. The crowd gasped. The look on Mark's face was something between surprise and the recognition of a story he did not control. He tried to stand tall, to remake shame into a grin, to use the bravado he had honed for years. Instead, his voice was swallowed by the sound of phones like rain. What happened then was quiet and unavoidable. Jenna moved forward and offered the organizer a copy of the full audit. A murmured exchange occurred on stage. Mark attempted to speak, but his voice trembled and then cracked. People named in the guest list sat in awkward silence. The audience, which had been ready to play along, instead witnessed the unfolding of a careful exposure. Names that had been used casually to justify jokes were now listed in an audit. The scene was not performed with raised multiples of accusation, but with the clinical sturdiness of certified facts. The aftershock landed in many forms. Social feeds went quiet, and then loud with debate. Donations to the community kitchen rose. People who had once deferred to Mark's social gravity now offered public apologies.
Carla sent a text that read simply, "I was wrong," and included a clumsy heart emoji. Layla issued a public note about looking for signs and not laughing at someone who is losing their footing. Mark eventually posted a rambling message that tried to balance denial with a variant of apology. Some read it as deflection. Others saw it as the first honest step. In private, Sarah received messages that mattered. Jenny, who had reopened a bakery, sent a long note about courage. Miguel offered a steady supplier discount because he believed in the service. Pastor Michael asked if they could use the restaurant for community dinners once a month. Daniel proposed a formal partnership and suggested they would open a small scholarship fund for kids like the one she had been fostering. The legal resolution followed the public reckoning. Settlements were discussed and then formalized. Mark agreed to a mediated restitution and to retract certain public statements. He wrote a short message to Sarah, a careful note that read, "I am sorry that I caused pain." It was not a grand apology, but it was a beginning. Sarah read it and felt no triumph. She felt the odd calm of someone who had been waiting for truth to be known and who had never wanted to be small so others could feel large. The epilogue shows the small, real changes and the timeline of healing. 1 month later,
Sarah had changed her phone number, but the restaurant had a line out the door on a Friday night. She felt tired in a new way, the fatigue of someone who had found purpose. The children she fostered had a steady bedroom in a small apartment above the restaurant that Daniel helped renovate. The room smelled of oatmeal and crayons and new paint. Neighborhood volunteers came in to help furnish shelves. Jenna sent a card to the staff thanking them for their steadfastness. The community kitchen began to take reservations for a monthly charity night, and Miguel offered to donate produce for the first 6 months. 3 months later, the legal matter had been settled. The mediated agreement included an acknowledgement of errors and a modest restitution fund to help support community programs that Sarah had started. The restaurants applied and received a small grant that allowed them to hire an assistant manager named Ellis who helped in logistics. Social media interest had settled into a supportive community of regulars who shared stories about rebuilding. The list of names who had once laughed included a few who offered public apologies and a few who remained silent. Sarah spoke at a local community center about resilience and evidence and how small acts build trust. 6 months later, a more settled season had arrived. The restaurant had a regular weekly community supper that served those in need at a reduced price. Daniel and Sarah had formalized their partnership and worked side by side. The 3 children were enrolled in nearby schools and called Sarah aunt without hesitation. Mark had retreated from the public sphere for a while and had enrolled in counseling. Some people still debated the fairness of public exposure, but a small scholarship fund in Sarah's name existed to help kids access summer programs. Sarah had learned to walk through the rain without counting how many feet she had lost or gained. She forgave Mark privately because forgiveness unbound her more than it affected him. She offered to meet once in a neutral space, not to punish him, but to close a chapter. Her final message to the audience was not about revenge, but about restoration. She spoke softly in one small video posted by Olivia's now reflective account. She said that dignity is not only regained in headlines, but in the small acts like showing up, paying a bill, answering a child at night, and opening a restaurant door for someone who has nowhere else to go. If this story moved you, please subscribe and share, and tell us in the comments with "I would have done" how you would face a moment of public shame. Your words help us all. The conclusion held a short recapitulation. She left a marriage with a bag and a mug and returned years later with children calling her aunt, a community kitchen humming with life, and a ledger of evidence that showed truth had weight. The change was practical. The restaurant paid rent, hired staff, and funded the scholarship. Mark sent a small message of apology, and she replied with calm, offering of peace, and no spectacle. If this story touched you, write in the comments and subscribe for more stories of people who turned hardship into honest work. What they called a humiliation became, in her hands, a doorway to rebuild. She walked through it with her head held high.